A very good morning, friends, and welcome to another fantastic Friday. Last week we were looking at challenges that face the church. This week is part 2 of that. We managed to really deal with two major elements, and that being of narcissism as well as a level of materialism as well. But today we're going to be carrying on looking at hedonism, and that is the lust of the flesh that comes out. I'm Rocky Stevenson, pastor of Benoni Bible Church, and welcome again to Let's Talk with me here on Radio Pulpit. Hedonism is the pursuit of pleasure as the highest good, and this philosophy has really seeped into the church in very subtle and dangerous ways. It's particularly evident in what I call spiritual hedonism, and that's the mindset that the primary goal of faith is personal happiness, emotional satisfaction, or constant blessings, rather than holiness and glorifying God. And we see this in so much of the church in our world, church in inverted commas as such. Much of what we see around us in many local churches is almost this idea of God is only the God of the mountaintops, instead of him being God of also the valleys, God of the bright days as well as God of the darkness. And spiritual hedonism has such deadly ends in mind. When churches present the Christian life as one of constant emotional highs and personal gratification, then they fall into the trap of this spiritual hedonism, this pursuit of pleasure, the constant dopamine rushes even inside of a local church context, the smoke machine, skinny jeans, messed up kind of a mentality that only seems to uphold this constant high as a local church, kind of a show and trying to make some kind of a seance even within a local body. And in this mindset, people begin to see God as a means to fulfill their desires rather than the object of their worship. This mentality fosters this unhealthy focus on self and on emotions rather than a proper understanding of discipleship and the cross. And the Apostle Paul reminds us of the need for maturity and the dangers of being led by our emotions. He says in Ephesians 4 verse 14, so that we may no longer be children, tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness in deceitful schemes. That's Ephesians 4 verse 14. How sad it is that it seems that there are some local churches, and whether or not they truly are biblically churches or not is, I guess, in the eyes of the Lord, but how they seem to craft these things, and the service is this entertainment, and everything has to be done for the show and for the lights and for the camera and for, camera, lights and action. And you almost seem to have a Seven Delan scene or some other series that plays out before you as you are the spectator and you are entertained. What a tragic, tragic thing. And the tragic result of such kind of a Christianity or such kind of a spiritual hedonism is burnout, depression, and suicide. The consequences of unchecked hedonism can be absolutely severe. When people base their faith on feelings and emotional highs, then they eventually face spiritual burnout, depression, and in extreme cases, even suicide. When life's hardships come, then they realize that their foundation was built on the sand of self-pleasure rather than on the solid rock of Christ. That's what happens when you have this constant dopamine rush and you try and call it, quote-unquote, Christian. The Bible says, whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. Mark 8 verse 35. Sadly, it seems that some try and set up some form of pseudo-Christianity that says you need to save your life. That's what you must do because that's how you save it. And you better not sacrifice. Everything has got to be an emotional high, and you constantly need to pretend that everything is going well. You better just speak those words of faith, they say to you. Now, true joy and fulfillment are not found in chasing after self-pleasure, but in surrendering to Christ and living for His glory. That is where true fulfillment biblically stands. Now, the church must teach that the Christian life is about self-denial and sacrificial love, not about meeting our every desire. How sad it is, this idea of the prosperity types of gospel, which just seems to be the God of the mountaintop instead of the God who is also with you in the valleys. And that leads us to the next major danger, and that is that of materialism. Because not only is there this danger of hedonism or narcissism, hedonism, there's also this materialism, and that is the lust of the eyes. Materialism is another powerful force that influences much of today's church. And at its core, materialism is the pursuit of wealth, possessions, and outward successes as indicators of a meaningful life. In other words, if you've got the gold, if you've got the glory, if you've got the girls, if you've got all of these things that the whole of the Gentile world is chasing after, then somehow you must be prosperous. You must be doing well before God. And we've seen much of in the 20th century, the rise of what is called the prosperity gospel, which wrongly teaches that financial gain and physical health are signs of God's blessings. I would direct you also to a sermon that was being preached recently by my fellow elder Henny Mulman, where he preaches about Lazarus and the rich man. And you can see that the rich man, he lands up in hell, and he's looking over to Father Abraham, and he's saying to him, won't you send Lazarus to just give a drip of water to my tongue? Where Lazarus was like a beggar. I mean, he was crippled and laying at the gate of the rich man in his life. But there's this mentality today amongst people that says, well, because you've got a lot, surely God must be blessing you, so you must be right. That's not what the Bible teaches. This kind of a teaching wrongly teaches that financial gain and physical health are signs of God's blessing. This false gospel has led many away from biblical truth, focusing in on temporary, earthly treasures rather than the eternal spiritual ones that are found in Jesus Christ. Now, what is this major danger that we have here? This idea of prioritizing wealth over spiritual growth. And the danger of materialism is that it causes believers to prioritize the pursuit of wealth and success over spiritual growth. Instead of storing up treasures in heaven, their hearts become captivated by the riches of this world. And Jesus warned us about this kind of a temptation in the parable of the rich fool. In Luke chapter 12, verse 15, Jesus says, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. Yet sadly today, it would seem even amongst some megachurches, there seems to be this idea that in the abundance of what you have, that's what your life really consists of. And you end up being like the pharaohs of old that store up their wealth, but when you die, you can take none of that with you. Just because you have lots, or just because you have a high position, or just because you have lots of pleasure in this life does not mean that you are right before God. And what material wealth, when it becomes the goal of life, it leads to spiritual poverty. Because people who prioritize material gain over Christ often fall into temptation, as Paul warns. He warns about this in 1 Timothy 6, verse 9 to 10. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation. He says this there. Now, dear listener, are you desiring to be rich? Is that what you're chasing after? Won't you realize that you are then on a treadmill like a rat in a cage, or like a hamster on a hamster wheel? And you are going nowhere slowly, because he says, God says to you in 1 Timothy 6, verse 9 to 10, but those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. 1 Timothy 6, 9 to 10. How do we correct this? Well, we correct this with contentment and generosity. We are so blessed materially in our day. Many have so much more than what they actually need, and God has given to many more than what they need. And the antidote towards this materialism is contentment in Christ and generosity towards others that are around you. Paul exhorts us to be content with the basic necessities of life, knowing that we brought nothing into this world and we can take nothing out of it. Listen to what 1 Timothy 6 verse 6 to 8 says. It says this, but godliness with contentment is great gain. And a little bit later on he says, if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. Don't you realize this, dear Christian, that you can be content with what the Lord has given you in this life? Of course, you ought to work hard. You ought to do everything that you do to the glory of God. The Christian should be the greatest worker of all people. And the Christian, in many respects, ought to be the most successful because they are doing what they do with great integrity and with great honesty. And you ought to be somebody that's content with what God gives you, knowing that everything you have comes from Him and that everything that you are belongs to Him. Contentment frees us from the endless pursuit of more and helps us to focus on eternal treasures. You know how many people are stuck in that place of constantly wanting more and wanting more and wanting more? As we live in contentment and generosity, we reflect the heart of Christ, who gave all for us. You know, dear one, that each one of us, unless the rapture happens, we will face death. And we will lie on our deathbed, where none of our bank balances or all of the things that we have possessed, where none of that counts for anything. And many a times, sadly, people will sacrifice the future on the present, on the altar of the present, instead of sacrificing the present on the altar of the future and honoring God and doing all that we do for His glory. You know, when you sacrifice time with your children or with your wife, with your family or with your church family, when you sacrifice that for money and for possessions and for wealth and for paying off things which you actually could not afford, but now you bought it on loan so that people that actually don't even like you would be impressed by you. What a silliness that is. What foolishness that is. What childishness is that? Rather, we need to spend our time and our efforts on those things that really count. We are called towards laying down our lives for Christ and for one another in the face of the temptations of pride, hedonism, materialism, that narcissism, hedonism, materialism, that idea of puff me, please me, and pay me. To get away from this, the church must return to the biblical vision of sacrificial discipleship. Jesus calls us to take up our cross and follow Him. And that stands in sharp and stark contrast to the world's message of self-indulgence and personal gain. We are called towards losing our life for Christ's sake. And that's the Christian life. It is marked by self-denial, not self-fulfillment. Jesus' call to discipleship is radical. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. Luke 9 verse 23 to 24. The world's message is one of self-gratification. Live for pleasure, live for yourself. But the gospel message is one of self-sacrifice. Live for Christ and live for others. Jesus gives us the perfect example of this. He laid down His life for us. Philippians 2 verse 5 to 8. We ought to be one another focused like Jesus was and Jesus is. The paradox of the Christian life is that true joy, fulfillment, and purpose come not from holding on to life, but from losing it for Christ's sake. As Mark 8 verse 35 says, for whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever would lose his life for my sake and the Gospel's will save it. May the Lord bless you. Amen.